Have you ever noticed whenever you talk to a socialist, then bring up the examples of previous socialist regimes, they always say that wasn't socialism. Soviet Union apparently wasn't socialism. Cuba wasn't socialism. All the countries that have been tried in China and everywhere else wasn't socialism. But recently there was one example, a very contemporary example, that socialists, including the Labour left, Jeremy Corbyn and everyone, have been quite proud to say that this is a successful socialist project. And because it was very recent, they can't deny it. Venezuela is a country that had a very rich history and culture, economically and politically, with democracy and everything, and until Hugo Chavez and his gang came into power. Now, what happened in Venezuela? This happened. In the words of Jeremy Corbyn and his friends, this is real socialism. People starving on the street, getting murdered by their government, not being able to get a job, buy food, buy clothes. That's real socialism. Although recently they've changed their tactic. Then if you ask your typical Labour left person and a typical socialist activist, they say, well, Venezuela is failing just a little bit because of American sanctions and because it's not socialist enough. I don't know how much socialist does he have to get for these people to realize this doesn't work. It's quite simple. They don't care about ordinary people and the effects it has on their lives. They just care about their cuckoo land, their ideology, their fantasy lands. And as long as that still is implemented, regardless of if it fails or succeeds, they're happy. But let's have a look at some facts. According to IMF experts, they estimate that inflation in Venezuela will reach 10 million% by the end of 2019. That means a product that at one point cost the equivalent of $1 will now cost the equivalent of $10 million. During most of the decades following Venezuela's adoption of a democratic government in 1958 through to the 1980s, the country was the richest nation in South America. But the policies that resulted in this chaos, obviously in the eyes of an ordinary person with common sense or someone who understands economics, is stupid and crazy. But in the eyes of a normal socialist person in the West, they're actually quite normal. It's nothing outrageous. They've done price controls, they've introduced extremely high minimum wage, they've obviously nationalized all the industries. These are the sort of things that a certain someone is in favor of. Do you remember? Jeremy Corbyn. For example, President Maduro has ordered 26 minimum wage increases in his 6 years in office, including a 300% increase earlier this year. But this is why we still have Labour members, including Jeremy Corbyn, Chris Williamson, John McDonnell and Ken Livingstone, supporting the Venezuelan government and obviously blaming all the issues on America and everything else.
Chris Williamson.
Mr. Speaker, the Venezuelan economy has been crippled by US sanctions, and the UN rapporteur, the first UN rapporteur to visit the country for 21 years, is quoted as saying this, Mr. Speaker: US sanctions on the country are illegal and could amount to crimes against humanity under international law. And a former special rapporteur, Alfred Desire, said that the US is waging economic warfare against Venezuela.
That's Chris Williamson. But what about Ken Livingstone?
I was able to do that because my friend Hugo Chavez, who was then president of Venezuela, cut the price of oil, and that allowed us to subsidize the fares. Chavez always worked to improve the poor all over the world, and that was one of the most wonderful things he did. It reduced poverty and gave people opportunities.
See, Ken Livingstone endorsed Venezuelan government's policies. He said Chavez always put the interests of the poor first. Rhetoric, rhetoric, rhetoric. Just because some socialist politician says nice things doesn't mean they mean nice things. As I said, this is what they're proposing in this country. And you see the results in Venezuela, in Iran, in other countries across the world with socialist governments. Do you really want that for our country in the UK? I hope not. But socialists always come with nice words and nice rhetoric. Chavez's first campaign, the slogan was hope and change. Again, just like the Labour Party in 2017. But this is why, as Milton Friedman said once, never judge a policy or a program by its intention, but do it by its outcome. And the same applies to Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Don't judge him by what he says, but what his track record actually shows you already. But going back to what's actually happening in Venezuela, ordinary people are actually being murdered, they're losing their houses, they're losing their jobs, they can't afford food. This is not a good situation, and we do need to help them. There's no action, there's no actual humanitarian focus when it comes to Venezuela. Everyone's afraid of doing this because they'll be labeled by the left-wing media and left-wing parties as some sort of CIA agent or MI6 agent. So even if we say anything, they say you're interfering into an independent country. Whereas somehow it's right for them to interfere in Israel's government policies. I don't know what's happening there, but that's the situation. But in general, socialism always requires a centralized planning system. The nice rhetoric can't be done by just words, because a lot of things that these advocates of socialism want to do, people don't really want them to do that. But as we said, socialists promise a paradise, but it ends up with people eating their pets.